Hey, what's going on? This is the Body Punch Podcast, and my name is Naz. Let's talk about MMA news. There has been some major events in the world of MMA and in combat sports, and I wanted to record this podcast just to talk about a bunch of these topics and just to dive in deep and discuss with you guys. And hopefully this can be a back and forth conversation that you can either do in the comment section of any of the podcast networks or in the YouTube comment section below. And we can talk about all of this stuff. There's been a bunch of stuff in the news with new fights announced, new fighters joining other organizations, and seeing what's next for fighters who have just recently fought. So the first topic that I wanted to talk about was new fight announcements and fighters joining other organizations. First of all, one of the number one fights to look out for that's coming down is Justin Gaethje versus Charles Oliveira. What a massive fight for the 155-pound division. For that belt, Charles Oliveira being on the tear that he is. This is the second title shot that Justin Gaethje is going to have, and it's going to be a special one. Seeing where Charles Oliveira is coming from in terms of beating some people that automatically thought that they had a right for that belt. Michael Chandler and Dustin Poirier at the time, when they fought for the belt against Charles Oliveira, it kind of felt like that belt was just ready for the taking. And both of those fighters were supposed to be Charles Oliveira. And it was such a surprise for the MMA world to see Charles Oliveira defeat both of them in spectacular fashion. The way that Charles Oliveira is buzzsawing through the 155-pound division is very special, and it is a must to compete with the aura and the way that Khabib ran that division. Even though Khabib wasn't at the top of that division for a very long time, he did rule by taking out some really big names, and it was very tough. Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, Conor McGregor, you name it. There was a bunch of heavy hitters that tried fighting Khabib Nurmagomedov, and for Charles Oliveira to keep that aura, to keep all of these guys at bay, in the 155-pound division, it's a shark tank. And Justin Gaethje is he's making the rounds again, trying to get that belt from Charles Oliveira. What a special fight. It's going to be a great one. And this is one of those ones that hopefully with a big crowd and with Charles Oliveira's, gaining popularity, it's gonna be a great one. Justin Gaethje, the highlight is always fun to watch, and he's a fan favorite. And it seems like they're throwing murder after Charles Oliveira, and if he can go through these tests, that could shoot him up as one of the greatest 155ers of all time really quickly. And this is exactly what he needs. Next fight outside of the UFC, I was talking about Khabib Nurmagomedov. Let's talk about his organization. Eagle FC is going to have a fight between Kevin Lee versus Diego Sanchez. That's going to be an interesting one, where Kevin Lee is more in his prime of his career, coming off a couple losses in the UFC, but it was against great competition. Diego Sanchez, unfortunately, leaving the organization, leaving the UFC, with bad terms, with weird coaching. There was a lot of things that was going on in Diego Sanchez's life that led to him leaving the UFC. Kevin Lee was a different reason. It seemed like due to the management that he had, it made the UFC kick him out. So this is going to be a good one in terms of name recognition for Eagle FC, meaning that you're going to get a lot of eyeballs on this event. But I think you're really teeter-tottering over that line of freak show fights versus a real organization like the Top Dogs, like ONE FC, like Bellator, like the UFC. Do you want to be known to put on these fights? Bellator, even the UFC puts on these fights like, for example, CM Punk or any Jake Hager in Bellator. These fighters that come in with big names and they're fighting opponents that they're just way above. So for Kevin Lee, this is a great start in the organization. This is just to get the motor running. But Eagle FC really has a lot of work ahead of them in signing some bigger names to the organization. That's going to be a tough one for Khabib Nurmagomedov and the crew there. Okay, so next fight. I think this is a really interesting one and great choice for the UFC. The UFC gets condemned for a lot of its choices that it makes in their matchmaking, but I think this is great matchmaking here. If you got a person like Cowboy Cerrone and Joe Lauzon who still want to fight in the top level organization, and they got these big names, and you know that you don't want them to leave and fight for one of your competitors, to have them go against each other is great. It's the perfect way for both of these fighters to carry on their career. Joe Lauzon being one of the highest paid athletes in the UFC via bonus. Cowboy Cerrone having the most wins in the UFC at one point. I still think that he has it. I'll have to double check on that, but both of these guys, record holders in the UFC. And for Cowboy Cerrone, who's kind of been slowing down in this part of his career, going against someone like Joe Lauzon, who's not gonna knock you out with a massive right hand or something like that. I think it's the perfect fight for him. It's a perfect fight to taper off his career. What a special career both of these men have had. Joe Lauzon taking off some time, and this is going to be his first COVID fight during this era. Who knows? Maybe he fights in the Apex without anybody. I forget if Cowboy Cerrone has fought in the Apex without anybody yet. But anyways, this is a great fight. We got to applaud the UFC at some point when they make great decisions like this. We can't just always just go after them for every little mistake that they make. This is a good fight. Great fan favorite fight. This is going to be. So let's talk about Jeremy Stephens, one of my favorite fighters, going off to the PFL, saying that he's making just a little bit more in his PFL career compared to his UFC career. The main thing for him is going into the 155-pound tournament and winning that $1 million. He says it's very doable. To be honest with you, it's not like we got some big names in that 155-pound division. You can name many in that division. Maybe Anthony Pettis might move down to 155. That was a super tough weight cut for him. He's now a 170 pounder. He might move up in weight as well. So and you got the current champion. But aside from that, and maybe like Rory McDonald, Jeremy Stephens, who's had a very long career, has kept it going with the way that he keeps his body, the way that he trains, the way that he operates has allowed him to have this long of a career. It's very special. Jeremy Stephens is a special fighter. I think just by looking at him, people forget how young he is, or excuse me, how old he is, because he looks so young. But, he's been in the game for a very long time, Jeremy Stephens. In terms of fight career, it's been a super long time. So, it's tough to see him go, but I think I think it might be a good move for him to start maybe making some moves in another organization like the PFL, who might have some easier fights for him. His last couple of fights have been with some killers who have honestly put a pace on him. Calvin Kattar comes to mind. In that fight, Calvin Kattar is a top contender. We just saw him take out Giga, and that just shows you that this guy, Calvin Kattar, is no joke. And for Jeremy Stephens to go in there and fight killer after killer all the time, it must be tough for him. And I really believe in sometimes getting an easier fight just to get the motor started. I was talking about Kevin Lee, Diego Sanchez. Kevin Lee's fight might be that Kickstarter that he needs, and it might just be perfect for both of them. So I think that Jeremy Stephens joining the PFL is a great one. Okay, so on to the next topic. I wanted to talk about what is next for Ciryl Gane and Francis Ngannou. So let's start with Ciryl Gane. Ciryl Gane, I think that there's a couple options for him. He's very young in his career. He's very young in age, especially for the heavyweight division. There's a lot of great fights that he could have. Some of them being Stipe Miocic and Jon Jones. Let's start off with Stipe Miocic. I think that this fight would be a great one. It will show us where Stipe is. It will also be a great way to kick back and start the gear again. I'm going to mention this a lot in this podcast, but start down the path of getting back to a title shot for Ciryl Gane and beating, in some people's opinions, the greatest heavyweight in the UFC ever, the greatest heavyweight champion ever. And beating someone like Stipe Miocic could put him on the right path and direction, and honestly give him that boost. It could be the fast pace, the fast. You could skip the queue just by beating someone like Stipe Miocic. Stipe, we all know, is waiting. It seems like he wants another crack at Francis Ngannou. They're 1-1. Stipe beat him once. Francis beat Stipe once. And so that's the way that Stipe Miocic sees this thing. He sees it as 1-1. He sees it as a tie at the moment. So he really wants to wait. And the more he waits, the older he gets. Now, Stipe is no spring chicken. He himself is getting a little bit too old for the heavyweight division, which is saying something. But I think that would be a very interesting fight. I think that would be a great way to get Ciryl Gane back on the path to the heavyweight championship of the world. And it could be Francis Ngannou fighting for the belt again. It could be Francis Ngannou staring at him again. But it's it's gonna be a good one. If it happens. So another one I think that a lot of people aren't talking about, and they just want Francis to fight him, is Jon Jones. I think that Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane could be really special. These big boys moving like they're 155 pounds, could be a massive win for Ciryl Gane if he can defeat Jon Jones. And honestly, why wouldn't Jon Jones want to take that fight? I mean, it's a tough fight. It might be a tougher fight than against Francis Ngannou, But at the end of the day, you beat someone like Ciryl Gane, that's a for sure title shot. Now, the thing is that he would want to actually fight the guy, meaning that Jon Jones could walk into the heavyweight division right now and fight for the belt. There's nothing stopping him. There's nothing really. He's Jon Jones. He's considered to be the greatest of all time. So he could honestly just walk in and face the heavyweight champion at any point in his career. But if he really wants to get a feel for the heavyweight division, maybe make some extra money and have 2 fights in a year, Ciryl Gane might be the perfect opponent for him to start off his heavyweight run. But let's talk about Francis Ngannou. And Francis Ngannou, just like I said before previously, Jon Jones could walk into any division and fight for that belt. And I mean any division. If Jon Jones wants to fight for a belt and he's agreed with the UFC that that's the belt that he wants to hold and that he's not having any issues outside of the cage, Jon Jones could just call out any fighter in the UFC and fight for that belt. So Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones looks like it's going to be the move. Now, Francis Ngannou still has a lot of legal things that he needs to go through. Maybe he doesn't fight for the UFC anymore. Who knows? But in this scenario, we're saying that Francis Ngannou stays with the UFC and fights UFC fighters. Now, I think that Jon Jones would be perfect opponent for Francis Ngannou. I think that this is the direction that everybody wants him to go, and it takes both parties. It takes Jon Jones. It takes Francis Ngannou. Now, who will budge first in terms of will Francis Ngannou settle on his contract, and will Jon Jones agree to fight for the heavyweight belt? Jon Jones has gone through a lot of issues, even as recently as being at the MMA awards, and then the next day, the police being called on him for domestic abuse. So he needs to get a lot of stuff together. Francis Ngannou needs to figure out where he is. But Francis Ngannou, if there is one fighter that has the opportunity to maybe, I'm not saying he's going to be one of those fighters that jumps around, and I don't think we're going to see that anytime soon, where they jump around organizations. But Francis Ngannou might have a chance to fight someone in the heavyweight boxing division. Tyson Fury is one of those fighters who I think after some time would love to take one of these fights against an MMA fighter. It's an easy fight for him, especially in the boxing ring, in my opinion. But for the public, it would be a great way. It would be a great marketing tactic because the public can get behind Francis Ngannou facing Tyson Fury. But what I think is the more interesting fight, and one that's might be a little bit more realistic for Francis Ngannou in terms of maybe even getting a win, is against Deontay Wilder. Now, Deontay Wilder, he is a pro boxer. He's someone who's fought in the Olympics, the Bronze Bomber. That's the reason that they call him the Bronze Bomber. But if there was ever someone in the top five of the heavyweight division who you could maybe even convince yourself Francis Ngannou has a chance with, it might be Deontay Wilder. Now, either way, if Francis Ngannou gets knocked out by Deontay Wilder, or if maybe somehow Francis Ngannou knocks out Deontay Wilder, either way, it's a special fight. It's something that the fans can get behind, and it's something that you could market so easily. What a spectacular fight that would be. But like I said before, I think that Francis Ngannou fighting in the UFC, fighting in MMA, it's where it's at. It's where everybody wants to see Francis Ngannou fight. It's just you don't want him to be distracted and jumping back and forth, like we've seen with other fighters, maybe like Conor McGregor, for example, who has thought about jumping back and forth a bunch of times, is always training for boxing, but then ends up doing an MMA fight. So you don't want to go into that situation where um, you just don't know what you're doing for your next fight and what kind of training you need. It's such specific training at the top tier of the game in boxing and in UFC. So we'll look out for that, see what Francis Ngannou does for his next fight. So the next topic I want to talk with you guys about is UFC Fight Night this weekend, February 5th. We got some great fights. I think it's one of those low-key in the know type of fight cards, featuring Jack Hermansson and Strickland. I think it's gonna be one that you got to watch out for. One of those ones that you could be just flipping through the channel if you're not a hardcore MMA fan and just skip over. But some of these fighters that are featured on this card, on this UFC Fight Night card, it has some big implications for the division. It has some big names on there, and it could show us where these fighters are at in their career. Sean Strickland is going to be fighting Jack Hermansson. Like I said, Jack Hermansson is, he's just one of those staples in the division. At one point, it seemed like he was going to make a massive, run for the title shot. Everybody was scared of him. He was just one of those fighters that if you went to the ground with him and tested out his jiu-jitsu, this was not someone that you wanted to do that with. But honestly, with fighting with Sean Strickland, it's gonna elevate his status. It's gonna really put him at the top of the board just by beating someone like that, who hasn't lost much in his career, has only lost 3 times in his career, has faced some big name fighters in Uriah Hall, and talks a whole bunch. Before the Uriah Hall fight, it was just a bunch of the only kind of name fighters that people might know of are like Court McGee or someone like that. But aside from that, big name has been Uriah Hall. He's been on a tear though, which is something that that is hard to do in this sport. Jack Hermansson, a little bit different. He's faced top competition in the division. His last win was against Edmund Shabazian. Edmund, coming into that fight, a lot of people were talking about how he trained his wrestling, how the mixture of his boxing and his wrestling would maybe cause problems with someone who is a more grappling heavy fighter like Jack Hermansson. But Jack Hermansson did what needed to be done. And I remember that fight. It was pretty grappling heavy fight. It was something that it looked like Edmund was not ready for. And at the end of the day, Edmund Shabazian is still a young kid. But for Jack Hermansson to go in there and take out someone like that, and then, coming off of tough losses from guys like Jared Cannonier and Marvin Vettori. Marvin Vettori was his most recent loss, and that's against someone who maybe didn't show his true colors against Israel Adesanya, but he is still someone that competed for that strap. So, and then beating guys like Kelvin Gastelum, who I hold in high regard, and taking out someone like that is super tough. Especially submitting him by heel hook the way that he did. In Abu Dhabi, you know how much I've been talking about in this podcast, if you listen to the other episodes, how much I think that Abu Dhabi and flying over, especially during that COVID time, was so tough for these fighters. It was something that not a lot of people were used to, the isolation and the way that they had to live. It was super tough for a lot of these fighters. And then right before that, it was like a teeter-totter. He lost to Jared Cannonier. TKO punches, Jared Cannonier. We all know that he throws those bombs. He's someone that is super strong, and you could have zigged and you wanted to zag, and it's all over. But some big names on his record, compared to Sean Strickland's. But Sean Strickland, maybe it's just the attitude that he has, the outrageous stuff that he says. He's become a big name in this division, and this is his biggest test. If he can get past someone like Jack Hermansson, it's going to show everybody that, he's ready for the big time. This is, I believe, it's number 7 in Sean Strickland versus number 6. A close matchup, close in the rankings. It's going to be big for everybody. A bunch of other great fights. The co-main event is a great one, and Hawaii's own fighting in that. That's going to be a great fight. Sam Alvey is coming back to face Phil Hawes. Smiling Sam Alvey, that's a tongue twister, is coming back middleweight bout. It's going to be a real test for Sam Alvey. I think he's getting up there in age. He's been a competitor in the division and in the UFC for a pretty long time. And it's going to be a big test. I think it's just going to be a fun fight. That's what we got to look out for. The prelim bout is also something that, a lot of people should check out. Me and Hakeem Dawodu in the featherweight division is coming back to fight. And it's always fun to watch him fight, taking the mean attitude and then changing it to, to kind of put that power into the area that he wants to put it into, like making sure that he doesn't go crazy in there, and taking out big time opponents like Khabib Nurmagomedov's still training partner and teammate, and doing that. We also got another Canadian, the Power Bar. He's always fun to watch. And yeah, I think there's a lot of fun fights on here. There's a lot of things that, maybe you could skip. Maybe you can go take a washroom break at that point. But there are a lot of fights at this UFC Fight Night, February 5th, 2022, that you cannot miss. So it's going to be a fun night of fights. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you guys listening. If you can like, subscribe, hit the bell notification if you're listening to it on YouTube. If you can leave a review, leave 5 stars. If you're listening on any of the podcast networks, that'd be highly appreciated as well. Send me an email, contact me. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about all this news, all the great stuff that these fighters are doing. I really appreciate you listening. I really appreciate you taking the time. This has been the Body Punch Podcast. My name is Naz.